Just pause and think. How could a queen marry without being pregnant? The dimly lit halls of the palace hide a secret that history tried desperately to conceal, but now the veil is about to be lifted. Every corridor, every chamber, every intricately carved door stands as a silent witness to a story far greater than mere power, politics, or tradition. This is the tale of a queen, whose life the world only saw in the sparkle of crowns and the grandeur of her palace. But the shadows of truth are far deeper, darker, and more unsettling. The trembling of her hands was not just a sign of human fragility. It bore the weight of an entire kingdom's expectations, its traditions, and the silent judgment of generations. People have always wondered, is it even possible for someone to marry without being pregnant? That question echoes through every hall, hides behind every gilded doorway, and lingers in the folds of every family secret. This secret does not rest merely on the pages of history. It lives in those silent moments that force us to confront how power, authority, and human fate intertwine in ways most cannot imagine. This moment, this fragile beginning, draws us into a story where every step carries risk, every gaze conceals cunning, and every decision can alter destiny itself. Within these palace walls, amidst glittering chandeliers, shadowed corners, and silent whispers, one thing cannot be hidden, the question we all ponder. How did the queen marry without being pregnant? The palace rose like a fortress of shadows and light, a sprawling monument to centuries of power, ambition, and unspoken secrets. Its towers scraped the grey sky, their spires disappearing into the low-hanging clouds, and the walls, cold and stone, seemed to hum with the weight of countless stories untold. From the outside, it appeared a place of majesty, adorned with golden carvings, ornate balconies, and wide gardens that bloomed in defiance of the gloom that clung to the city beyond. But within, the air was thick with expectation, whispers, and the constant, unyielding pressure of tradition. The corridors, lined with the faces of kings and queens long past, felt alive, their painted eyes following every step, silently judging every gesture. Each archway and winding stair, every velvet curtain and candle-lit chamber, contained echoes of voices that had never been spoken aloud, secrets that were buried beneath centuries of royal pretense. The palace was not merely a home, it was a labyrinth of power, where every decision, every glance, and every breath carried the weight of a kingdom's past and the threat of its future. Within this immense and suffocating structure lived the queen, a young woman of extraordinary poise and intelligence, yet bound by the invisible chains of duty and expectation. Her mornings began before the sun could pierce the horizon, her day dictated by ceremonial rituals, audiences with ministers, and the meticulous observation of courtiers whose eyes were sharper than any blade. Every movement was measured, every expression weighed, and every word, no matter how trivial, could ripple through the halls like a hidden current of consequence. She was surrounded by attendants who moved like shadows, silent observers whose loyalty was measured not by affection, but by their adherence to protocol. And though she was the center of this glittering world, she existed in isolation, a prisoner of gilded walls and polished floors, where the only freedom allowed was the careful cultivation of appearances. Beneath the surface of her serene composure, a storm of questions, doubts, and fears raged silently, threatening to spill over into moments that no one would witness but herself. The weight of expectation was compounded by the whispers that traveled through the palace like invisible threads, binding every action to the judgment of ancestors long dead. Portraits of queens who had lived and died, their eyes painted with a mix of dignity and sorrow, lined the walls, silent reminders of the narrow path that each royal woman was forced to walk. The queen knew that her every choice would be dissected, not only by those who roamed the corridors of the present, but also by the ghosts of those who had come before, whose achievements, mistakes, and sacrifices continued to dictate the limits of possibility. She understood that marriage, duty, and even the act of carrying life were not merely personal matters, but instruments of power, tools wielded by the monarchy to shape the destiny of nations. And yet, in the shadows of these ancient halls, a question loomed, a question that no one dared to ask aloud. How could a queen navigate the intricate web of duty, desire, and secrecy without succumbing to the chains of expectation? And what hidden truths lay buried beneath the veneer of ceremony, opulence, and tradition? Within the confines of her private chambers, the queen's world shifted from the external glare of ceremonial expectation to the internal gravity of contemplation and quiet rebellion. The rooms, though lavishly adorned with tapestries woven in threads of gold and deep crimson, seemed to absorb her anxieties rather than soothe them. The flickering candlelight played across carved furniture and marble floors, casting long shadows that danced like spectres of the past. Every delicate item, the porcelain vases, the jeweled boxes, the intricately embroidered cushions, carried the weight of tradition, each artifact a symbol of the legacy she was both heir to and prisoner of. In these hours of solitude, she was acutely aware of the paradox she lived within. The opulence that surrounded her provided comfort to the eyes, but imprisoned the mind. Here, in the silence of her private quarters, she could feel the full measure of expectation pressing upon her, not from any single individual, but from the countless generations of monarchy that had come before, whose triumphs and failures seemed etched into the very walls of the palace. She moved through her chambers with deliberate care, each step measured, each breath controlled, as though the shadows themselves were observers judging her every gesture. In the quiet, she contemplated the impossible choices that lay before her, the hidden mechanisms of power that dictated the lives of those bound to the throne. Marriage, a seemingly simple act to outsiders, was a complex web of duty, obligation, and the projection of political influence. It was a tool of diplomacy, a measure of legacy, and, above all, a test of loyalty to her family, to the kingdom, and to the invisible chains of tradition that constrained her. And yet, she carried within her an awareness that the rules she was expected to obey were not universal truths, but constructs designed to preserve the power of others. Every expectation placed upon her, every whispered warning, every admonition from advisors, every unspoken glance from her counsel, felt like another thread in a tapestry of control, binding her actions to outcomes she had not chosen, yet could not escape. Amid these reflections, a deeper tension began to build. The collision of duty with secrecy, tradition with desire, expectation with personal truth. The queen understood that within this gilded cage, she held the potential to disrupt centuries of precedent with a single choice. Yet to do so would require navigating a labyrinth of subtle power plays, hidden agendas, and invisible eyes that saw all but revealed nothing. Each night, as the palace exhaled its day and the corridors emptied into silence, she would trace the line between her own will and the unyielding pressure of the crown. She pondered the impossibility of maintaining appearances while harboring truths that could unravel the carefully constructed narrative of her life. The walls, steeped in history, seemed to lean closer as though the palace itself conspired to remind her of the stakes. Every secret carried weight, every decision rippled outward, and every misstep could echo across the kingdom long after she was gone. Within this tension, she sensed the first inklings of the profound and unsettling reality that would define her story. A reality that history would later obscure, and yet one that pulsed through every shadowed corridor of her life. How to exist fully under scrutiny, fulfill the expectations of a realm, and yet preserve the secrets that made her human. Outside the queen's chambers, the palace thrummed with the constant, invisible currents of intrigue, expectation, and unspoken judgment. The courtiers, ministers, and attendants moved through gilded halls like pieces on a vast chessboard, their every motion carefully calculated to maintain appearances while advancing subtle agendas. Every ceremony, every banquet, and every public display was layered with meaning, a careful performance in which the queen herself played both lead and captive. Though the opulence suggested abundance and celebration, the air was thick with tension. Each decorative flourish, from the sparkling chandeliers to the meticulously arranged flowers, served as both stage and reminder that nothing within these walls was accidental. Even the architecture itself, with its towering columns and labyrinthine corridors, seemed designed to manipulate perception, ensuring that observers always remained slightly off balance, aware that what was visible was only a fraction of the story. Within this carefully orchestrated theatre of power, the Queen felt the full burden of her isolation. She moved silently through the grand halls when the court was asleep, tracing the etched stone floors with quiet, measured steps. Each shadow seemed to whisper reminders of her responsibilities and the inescapable scrutiny that enveloped her. There was no private moment untouched by history, no quiet corner unconnected to the legacy she had inherited. The expectations of her lineage weighed upon her like a heavy cloak, the fabric stitched from centuries of precedent, honor, and rigid protocol. In this crucible of ritual and image, she found herself contemplating the impossible. How could she fulfill the demands of a kingdom, satisfy the endless expectations of courtly life, and yet preserve the secrets that were uniquely hers? On the weight of that question pressed upon her relentlessly, reminding her that while the palace offered safety, it also demanded obedience, and the line between survival and conformity was as narrow and treacherous as the marble bridges that arched over the shadowed palace gardens. As dusk settled over the city beyond the palace walls, the shadows deepened, merging the seen and unseen into a single, oppressive darkness. In the quiet of her private chambers, she began to sense the full scale of what lay ahead, a path lined with decisions so consequential that a single misstep could reshape her life, the court, and even the kingdom itself. Her mind moved constantly, weighing scenarios, imagining the ripple effects of every choice, and considering the ways in which appearances could be manipulated to conceal truths that must remain hidden at all costs. The palace itself, with its towering walls and hidden corridors, seemed to lean in closer, as if it were a living entity aware of the secret she carried and the extraordinary tension it produced. In that stillness, the impossible became tangible. The realization that she might be forced to navigate marriage and expectations in ways that defied every convention, challenge every assumption, and conceal truths that the world was never meant to know. And yet, beneath the weight of history, protocol, and unyielding expectation, one thought lingered, sharper and more unsettling than all the rest. How would she survive, maintain control, and preserve the secret of her own truth within a world that demanded compliance, conformity, and the sacrifice of self? The Queen's world, once cloaked in the deceptive calm of ceremony and tradition, began to unravel in subtle, almost imperceptible ways. Whispers from the corridors took on sharper edges, each comment and cautious glance carrying the weight of hidden meanings. Advisors and ministers, who had once bowed to the comfort of routine, now tested boundaries, probing for cracks in her composure. Each passing day brought a new challenge, a reminder that the palace's power was not only in its walls, but in the intricate web of influence, manipulation, and silent coercion that spanned every level of courtly life. She realized that what seemed like ordinary protocol was in truth a meticulously constructed maze designed to ensnare her choices, bind her will, and obscure the truth she was determined to protect. The Queen's mind became a battlefield, torn between outward obedience and inward defiance. Every decision, no matter how minor, was fraught with consequence. The expectation to produce an heir, to navigate alliances, to embody the perfection of royalty without revealing the fragility of her humanity, weighed upon her with increasing intensity. As the days stretched into weeks, the tension escalated into a pervasive unease, a silent pressure that grew more suffocating with each measured step through the palace halls. Each conversation with a courtier, each interaction with a noble guest, became a negotiation of power and perception. She saw the scrutiny in eyes that feigned deference but held judgment, and she felt the subtle currents of envy, suspicion, and resentment flowing through those who hungered for influence and control. In these moments, the palace transformed, from a place of sanctuary into a theatre of psychological trials where every shadow, Every whisper and every polished smile was a potential threat. Beneath this relentless tension, the Queen began to uncover the deeper injustices embedded within the monarchy's structure. Power was wielded not through overt force, but through expectation, manipulation, and the silent enforcement of roles, assigned by centuries of precedent. The young women of the court, whose lives mirrored hers in confined ways, whispered of sacrifices demanded by lineage, of futures preordained by others' ambitions, and of the invisible bonds that constricted freedom. The Queen listened, learned, and felt an awakening within herself, a simmering awareness of how unfairly the systems of authority manipulated life, dictated choices, and erased individuality. And as the palace grew darker each night, the emotional weight of understanding these injustices pressed upon her chest. She realized that she was not merely navigating the intricate formalities of marriage and duty. She was confronting a culture of power that demanded obedience, suppressed truth, and silenced resistance. The tension within her mounted, and with it, a sense of impending reckoning, as if the very walls of the palace were conspiring to test her resolve, patience, and cunning. The palace, with all its grandeur, became a labyrinth of unseen threats, whispered conspiracies, and subtle manipulations. Each new day revealed layers of deception that stretched deeper than the Queen could have imagined. Courtiers who once offered polite smiles now carried intentions sharpened by ambition and envy, their words carefully measured to influence, unsettle, or control. She began to sense the currents of power flowing through the halls, invisible yet forceful, shaping every encounter, every choice, every reaction. Even her closest attendants, bound by duty and fear, acted in ways that could no longer be taken at face value. The Queen realized that her life was a delicate balancing act, each move calculated to preserve appearances, safeguard secrets, and protect the fragile equilibrium of her world. As she navigated this web of intrigue, the personal stakes became increasingly profound. The expectation to marry, to fulfill the ceremonial obligations of royalty, and to produce an heir was not merely tradition. It was a weapon wielded against her autonomy. Pressure from advisors, reminders from her family, and the silent gaze of history pressed upon her relentlessly. Her thoughts oscillated between compliance and rebellion, between the need to survive and the desire to assert her own will. And yet the more she resisted internally, the more the palace seemed to tighten its grip. Hidden rules, invisible boundaries, and the judgment of both past and present generations formed an unyielding cage around her spirit. The tension was no longer abstract. It had become physical, pressing down like the stone walls themselves, forcing her to confront the limits of her endurance. Amid this psychological siege, the Queen began to uncover the depth of systemic injustice embedded within the court and the wider kingdom. She observed the fates of other women, bound by the same invisible chains of expectation, and understood that her struggles were part of a larger pattern, a culture that rewarded obedience, punished independence, and measured worth in conformity, rather than merit. The realization struck her with increasing intensity. The palace was not merely a residence or a seat of power. It was an instrument of control, meticulously designed to suppress individuality, silence dissent, and preserve structures that benefited only the privileged few. Every banquet, every audience, every seemingly casual remark revealed itself as a mechanism of subtle coercion. In response, a quiet fire kindled within her, a determination to navigate the impossible path laid before her while retaining agency, even within a system designed to extinguish it. This inner rebellion, however, could not be expressed openly. Each thought, each flicker of defiance had to remain hidden behind the mask of royal composure. The Queen's awareness of injustice and manipulation intensified her isolation, amplifying every whisper, every shadow, every calculated glance into a palpable tension. She understood that the choices she made, both public and private, would shape not only her destiny, but the future of the kingdom itself. The stakes had never been higher, and the pressure never more suffocating. Every corridor seemed to close, In every portrait's gaze seemed to follow her, and every decision felt like a pivot upon which her entire life, and the lives of those bound to her, might turn. As the days stretched into nights, the Queen sensed that the moment of reckoning approached. The palace's intricate web of expectations and obligations and manipulations could no longer hold her in equilibrium. A choice loomed ahead, a moment that demanded courage, cunning, and a willingness to confront not only the palace, but the forces of history itself. The tension had reached its zenith. The quiet, simmering injustices, the emotional stakes, and the suffocating weight of duty were all converging. In this crucible, the Queen would be tested as never before. The question that had haunted every corridor, every shadow, and every whispered conversation grew sharper. How would she assert her will, preserve her secrets, and survive in a world that demanded everything but offered nothing in return? The night descended like a velvet curtain, suffocating yet full of portent. Within the palace walls, shadows seemed to deepen, curling around corners, stretching across floors, and seeping into every crevice. The Queen moved silently through corridors she knew too well, her heartbeat a steady drum in the stillness, echoing the tension that gripped her mind. Every whisper, every distant footstep, every flicker of candlelight seemed amplified in the silence, each a reminder that at any moment a single misstep could unravel everything she had struggled to maintain. The weight of centuries pressed down on her, and yet beneath it, a strange clarity emerged, a resolute awareness that the moment to confront the impossible had arrived. The decisions she had wrestled with for weeks, the subtle calculations, the quiet rebellions of thought, converged into a single, decisive point. The palace, with all its intricate codes of behavior and silent enforcers of tradition, offered no safe path. Every expectation, every demand of duty, and every ghost of the past converged into a labyrinth that could only be navigated with courage, cunning, and absolute determination. The Queen's mind raced, tracing countless scenarios, measuring risks, and imagining consequences that stretched far beyond the walls she walked. And in that moment, the palace itself seemed alive, its shadows shifting, its silence heavy with judgment, as though the building, the history, and the very kingdom were holding their collective breath, waiting to see what she would do. Her choice, though unseen by the world outside, carried the weight of history. She understood the power and danger of secrecy, the delicate balance between obedience and defiance, and the perilous terrain she had to traverse. Every whispered command, every glance of expectation from those around her, every lingering tradition was a thread she had to manipulate without unraveling the intricate tapestry of the kingdom's perception. And yet, beneath all this calculation, there was an undeniable truth. The human spirit, though constrained, could still exert force in ways that tradition and protocol could not fully anticipate. The tension reached a crescendo as the Queen stepped into the room that would define the turning point of her life, the chamber where expectations, secrets, and the immutable laws of power collided in a single breathless instant. Within that chamber, the Queen's reality crystallized. She faced not only the demands of her family, her kingdom, and her advisors, but also the invisible yet unyielding chains of history itself. The choice she made would reverberate far beyond her own experience, shaping narratives, influencing alliances, and challenging the assumptions of those who had underestimated her resolve. Every heartbeat seemed to mark the passage of inevitability. Every shadowed corner threatened revelation. Every breath was heavy with consequence. The walls, steeped in centuries of expectation, watched silently. Yet even in their stillness, there was a sense of impending change, as though the palace itself recognized the monumental significance of the moment. And then, as if the world itself held its breath, the Queen acted, the culmination of every secret plan, every carefully weighed decision, and every flicker of inner rebellion found its expression. In that act, silent, deliberate and profound. She challenged the very structures that had constrained her, confronted the injustices that had sought to define her, and asserted a power that was uniquely, wholly hers. The tension, previously coiled and oppressive, erupted into a transformative realization. While the kingdom's eyes would only see ceremony and compliance, the truth of her choice radiated in ways unseen, shaping the course of events in ways no observer could predict. In the aftermath, silence filled the chamber like a tangible presence. The weight of history, the demands of tradition, and the eyes of generations past seemed momentarily suspended, as though acknowledging that a new paradigm had been quietly established. The Queen, poised yet forever changed, understood that the journey had not ended, that the palace still held dangers and expectations, but that she had navigated the impossible and emerged not merely surviving, but asserting her autonomy in ways that would echo far beyond her own lifetime. And in the hush that followed, the unspoken question remained, echoing through the marble halls, whispered to the shadows. How does one reconcile duty with self, tradition with truth, and expectation with freedom? The echoes of the night lingered long after the Queen's decisive act, filling the palace with a tension that had shifted subtly, almost imperceptibly, yet irrevocably. The corridors, once oppressive with expectation and secrecy, now seemed to pulse with a quieter, more watchful energy. Shadows still stretched along the marble floors, yet there was a difference. They no longer loomed purely as instruments of intimidation, but as silent witnesses to a courage that had defied convention. The Queen moved through these halls with a measured grace, each step carrying the weight of both past and future, a delicate balance between adherence to tradition and the assertion of her own truth. In her heart, she felt the strange duality of relief and awareness. Relief that a course of action had been taken. Awareness that the ripples of this decision would extend far beyond her immediate understanding. The world outside the palace, ever oblivious to the intricacies of internal struggle, continued as it always had. Diplomats, advisors, and courtiers carried on with routines, unaware of the profound choices that had quietly unfolded within the shadowed chambers. Yet the Queen's experience was a stark testament to the invisible forces that govern lives, particularly those of women and the powerless across time and place. The injustices she had faced, expectations imposed by lineage, societal pressure to perform roles defined by others, and the silent manipulation of power structures were neither unique nor confined to royalty. Her story, though wrapped in the trappings of history and opulence, reflected a universal struggle. The tension between individual agency and systemic constraint, the collision of personal truth with collective expectation. As the days passed, the Queen's presence radiated a subtle shift in the palace's dynamics. Observers noted a confidence, an almost imperceptible assertiveness in her posture, gestures, and decisions. While the kingdom's formal structures remained intact, the invisible currents that had once bound her now responded differently. The story of her quiet defiance became a thread woven into the fabric of the palace, a silent challenge to conventions that had persisted for centuries. And though she remained bound by many obligations, there was an enduring, unspoken victory, the reclamation of autonomy within a world designed to suppress it. Yet, the most profound impact was not merely in the external world, but within the Queen herself, through confrontation with impossibility, through navigation of secrecy, pressure, and expectation. She had discovered the resilience of the human spirit. The palace walls, the traditions, and the weight of history had not vanished, but their dominion over her had been recalibrated. She understood that power, true power, did not reside solely in crowns, titles, or ceremonies. It resided in the courage to act with awareness, to make choices grounded in both intellect and principle, and to hold on to one's truth amidst relentless pressure. In that realization lay a lesson not just for royalty, but for all who navigate systems that demand conformity over selfhood. Even in the most constrained circumstances, agency can emerge, quietly yet irrevocably, altering outcomes and defining legacies. The story closes not with finality, but with contemplation. The palace, in all its grandeur and shadow, continues to exist as a symbol of tradition and expectation. Yet, the Queen's journey reminds us that within every structure of authority, within every hierarchy of power, there exists the potential for subtle, yet profound transformation. History often records the visible, the ceremonial, the public, but the quiet rebellions, the internal triumphs, and the assertion of personal truth remain hidden, known only to those who dared to act, to resist, and to survive. And as the candlelight flickers across ancient walls, one question persists, echoing through the corridors of memory and imagination. What does it truly mean to honor duty while remaining faithful to oneself? And how far would you go to claim the truth that others seek to suppress?